Before we begin, if you love stories of redemption, power, and destined mates, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Drop a comment telling me which wolf name you'd choose for yourself. Now, let's dive into a story where a single name shattered an empire. The Great Hall of the Northern Pack reeked of wine, roasted meat, and arrogance, the kind of arrogance that came from centuries of unchallenged power, from bloodlines so pure they believed themselves untouchable, and from an alpha king who had never once questioned his right to rule over every wolf, every territory, every beating heart within his domain. King Alaric Thornwood sat upon his obsidian throne, one leg draped carelessly over the armrest, his silver eyes scanning the room with the bored detachment of a predator who had grown tired of easy prey. And beside him stood his council of elders, their faces carved from stone and disapproval, their hands clasped behind their backs as they watched the evening's entertainment unfold with barely concealed disdain. The occasion was meant to be a celebration, a gathering of the 5 great packs to honor the Blood Moon Treaty that had kept peace for 3 generations. But beneath the forced smiles and raised goblets lay tension thick enough to choke on, old grudges that festered like infected wounds, territorial disputes that simmered just below the surface, and the ever-present question of succession that hung over the Northern Pack like an executioner's blade. Alaric had no Luna, no mate, no heir, and at 32 years old, with the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders, the pressure from the council had become suffocating. A constant drumbeat of duty and expectation that followed him from sunrise to moonset, reminding him that even kings were slaves to tradition, to bloodlines, to the ancient laws written in wolf blood and lunar fire. The servant girl moved through the hall like a ghost, her head bowed low, her dark hair falling forward to hide her face as she carried trays of food and drink from table to table, refilling goblets with wine that cost more than her life was worth, clearing plates stained with grease and bone, never once meeting anyone's eyes, because that was the first rule they taught you when you were nothing, when you were invisible, when your very existence was considered a mercy granted by those who fed you scraps and reminded you daily that you should be grateful for the privilege of serving your betters. Her name was Sarah, though no one here knew it or cared to learn it, and she had been brought to the Northern Pack 6 months ago from the ruins of the Eastern Territories, a refugee from a massacre that had left her orphaned and alone, her pack slaughtered by rogues who showed no mercy to the weak, the elderly, or the children who couldn't shift fast enough to run. She remembered the smell of burning wood and flesh, the sound of her mother's final scream, the sight of her father's body broken and bloodied in the dirt, and she remembered the terrible silence that came after, the weight of survival when everyone you loved had been torn apart, the guilt that gnawed at her insides like a living thing because she had hidden while others died, because she had been too afraid to fight, because she was still breathing when so many weren't. The Northern Pack had taken her in, not out of kindness, but out of obligation, a political gesture to show the other territories that they honored the old ways, that they protected the remnants of fallen packs. But the reality was far less noble because she was given the lowest position in the household, assigned to the kitchens and the cleaning staff, worked from dawn until her hands bled and her bones ached, and treated with the kind of casual cruelty that people reserved for things they didn't consider fully alive. She was pouring wine into the goblet of a visiting beta from the Western Pack when she felt eyes on her, a sensation that made her skin crawl and her wolf stir uneasily beneath her ribs, that primal instinct that warned of danger even when you couldn't see it. And when she glanced up through the curtain of her hair, she saw him, King Alaric himself, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between curiosity and contempt, amusement and assessment, as though she were a puzzle he had just noticed and was debating whether she was worth solving. His beta, a man named Marcus who wore his loyalty like armor and his suspicion like a blade, leaned close and whispered something in the king's ear, something that made Alaric's lips curve into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And then the king was standing, his massive frame unfolding from the throne with the grace of a predator rising from rest, and the entire hall fell silent as he descended the steps, his boots echoing against stone, every eye turning to follow his path as he crossed the floor with deliberate slowness, each step measured and purposeful, and Sarah's heart began to hammer in her chest because she knew with the certainty of prey that has been marked, that he was coming for her. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could smell the scent of pine and smoke that clung to his skin, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze, even though every instinct screamed at her to keep her eyes on the floor, to make herself smaller, to disappear. But his presence was like gravity, and she couldn't look away. His voice when he spoke was deep and rich, the kind of voice that could command armies or seduce empires. And it carried through the hall with crystal clarity so that everyone could hear what he said next, every wolf in attendance bearing witness to what he intended as entertainment, as a game, as a reminder of his power and her insignificance. "You," he said, gesturing lazily at her with the hand that held his goblet, wine sloshing slightly against the rim. "What's your name, girl?" She swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust, and managed to whisper, "Sarah, Your Majesty," her voice so quiet it barely qualified as sound. And he tilted his head as though considering whether she had actually spoken or if he had imagined it. "Sarah?" he repeated, tasting the name like it was something bitter on his tongue. And then his smile widened into something sharp and cruel. "And tell me, Sarah, have you shifted yet? Or are you one of those unfortunate wolves who never will, who live their entire lives trapped between human and beast, neither one thing nor the other, useless to pack and bloodline alike?" The question landed like a physical blow, designed to humiliate, to expose whatever weakness she carried, and she felt heat flood her cheeks as laughter rippled through the hall. The sound harsh and mocking, dozens of voices joining in the amusement at her expense. And she wanted to run, wanted to vanish into the stones beneath her feet. But she was frozen in place by the weight of his attention. By the way, his silver eyes pinned her like a butterfly to a board. "I have shifted, Your Majesty," she said, forcing the words past the lump in her throat, keeping her chin lifted even though her hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped the pitcher she was holding. And Alaric's eyebrows rose in exaggerated surprise, as though the idea that she might have a wolf at all was somehow shocking, somehow worthy of further investigation. "Have you now?" he drawled, taking a slow sip of his wine, drawing out the moment, savoring her discomfort the way a cat savors the final moments before it kills the mouse. "It has been batting around for sport. And what is your wolf's name, little servant? What grand title has the universe bestowed upon something so small and forgettable?" The laughter grew louder, more pointed, and she could see the faces around her, the sneers and the grins, the way they leaned forward in their seats like spectators at a blood sport, eager to see her broken, eager to watch the king tear apart someone who couldn't fight back. And she realized with bitter clarity that this was how power worked. Not through grand battles or noble deeds, but through small cruelties inflicted on those who had no choice but to endure them. She should have lied, should have given him something harmless and forgettable, some bland title that would have satisfied his need for dominance and allowed her to slink back into obscurity. But something in her snapped, some part of her that had been bent too far, pushed too hard, humiliated too many times. And before she could stop herself, the words were spilling out, raw and defiant, laced with a bitterness she had swallowed for months. "Iron Widow," she said, her voice suddenly clear and strong, cutting through the laughter like a blade through silk. And the silence that followed was absolute, total. The kind of silence that comes when the world itself holds its breath, when reality tilts on its axis and no one is quite sure what will happen next. She watched Alaric's face change, watched the amusement drain from his features like water through a sieve, watched his skin go pale as though all the blood had fled to his heart, watched his eyes go wide with something that looked like recognition, like horror, like he had just seen a ghost rise from a grave he thought sealed, and then his legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed, his goblet clattering to the floor and spilling wine across the stone like spilled blood, and chaos erupted. The hall exploded into motion, betas and warriors surging forward to catch their king before he hit the ground. The council shouting orders and demanding answers, women screaming and men cursing as panic spread like wildfire through the assembled wolves. And Sarah stood frozen in the center of it all, the pitcher still clutched in her white-knuckled grip, watching as the most powerful alpha in the 5 territories lay unconscious at her feet, felled not by blade or poison or enemy attack, but by 2 simple words that she barely understood herself. Marcus was barking commands, calling for the pack healer, for guards, for someone to remove the girl, and rough hands seized her arms, dragging her backward as she struggled to process what had just happened, what she had done. And then the healer was there, an ancient woman named Alara, whose eyes held the silver glow of moon magic, and she was pressing her gnarled hands to Alaric's temples, muttering words in the old tongue that made the air shimmer and crack with power. The king's eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused, and he gasped like a man drowning, his chest heaving as he fought for breath. And when his gaze found Syrah across the distance that now separated them, he looked at her not with anger, but with something far more dangerous, something that made her wolf howl inside her chest, a mixture of awe and terror and desperate, aching need that she couldn't name, but felt echoing in her own bones. They locked her in a chamber in the eastern tower, a room that was technically a guest suite, but functioned as a prison, given that the door was guarded by two massive warriors who looked like they could tear her apart without breaking a sweat. And she spent the night pacing the length of the space like a caged animal, her mind racing through possibilities and explanations, trying to understand what power those words held, why they had affected him so profoundly, what ancient connection existed between the name Iron Widow and the Alpha King who ruled the North with absolute authority. She had heard the name before, in fragmented stories told by her grandmother before the massacre. Tales of a legendary Luna who had lived centuries ago during the time of breaking, a period so violent and chaotic that most of the written records had been destroyed, leaving only oral tradition and half-remembered myths passed down through generations of wolves who weren't entirely sure what was truth and what was embellishment. The Iron Widow, according to legend, had been the mate of the first Alpha King, a woman of such immense power that she could command not just her own pack, but entire armies. A Luna who had fought beside her mate in battles that shaped the very boundaries of their world, who had been both beloved and feared in equal measure, and whose death had supposedly brought the first king to his knees with grief so profound it had altered the course of wolf history forever. But those were just stories, fragments of a past so distant it might as well be fiction, and Sarah had never imagined that speaking that name would trigger such a visceral response in a modern alpha, would cause a king to collapse as though struck by the hand of the divine. She didn't sleep, couldn't sleep, kept returning to the window to watch the moon track its path across the sky, that silver disk that governed so much of their existence, that tied their power to its phases and waxing and waning strength, and she found herself whispering to it the way her grandmother had taught her, asking for guidance, for protection, for some understanding of what was happening to her. But the moon remained silent and distant, offering no answers, no comfort, only its cold and impartial light. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the door opened and Marcus entered, his expression grim, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword, and he looked at her with the kind of assessment that comes from years of evaluating threats, deciding whether she was dangerous or merely unfortunate, whether she needed to be eliminated or could be controlled. "The king wants to see you," he said, his voice flat and professional, offering no hint of his personal opinion on the matter. And when she opened her mouth to ask questions, he held up a hand to silence her. "You'll get your answers from him, not from me. And I suggest you show proper respect, because there are members of the council who would prefer you didn't leave that meeting room alive." The walk through the palace felt like a march to execution, servants and pack members stopping to stare as she passed, their expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility to something that might have been pity. And she kept her head high and her shoulders back because she had survived the death of her pack, had endured 6 months of abuse and invisibility, and she would be damned if she let them see her afraid now, even if her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it echoing in her ears. The king's private study was smaller than she expected, lined with books and maps and artifacts that spoke of a mind that valued knowledge as much as strength. And Alaric stood with his back to her, staring out a window that overlooked the northern forests, his hands clasped behind him, his posture rigid with tension. When Marcus closed the door, leaving them alone, the silence stretched between them like a living thing, heavy with unspoken questions and dangerous possibilities. And she waited because she had learned that sometimes survival meant letting powerful people speak first, letting them reveal their intentions before you committed to a response. "Do you know what you are?" he asked finally, his voice rough as though he had spent the night screaming or perhaps not speaking at all. And he turned to face her, and she was struck by how different he looked in the morning light. How the arrogance had been stripped away to reveal something raw beneath, something haunted. "Do you have any idea what it means that your wolf carries that name?" She shook her head, refusing to lie, refusing to pretend she understood when she was just as lost as he seemed to be. And he laughed, but it was a bitter sound, devoid of humor, the laugh of a man who has just realized the universe has been playing a joke on him for years. "Iron Widow," he said, speaking the name with something approaching reverence, approaching fear, "was the destined mate of the first Alpha King, my ancestor, the wolf from whom every Northern Pack Alpha draws their bloodline and their right to rule. And according to every prophecy, every scrap of ancient text, every vision recorded by the moon priestesses over 1,000 years, she was supposed to be reborn when the bloodline was in danger of dying out, when the pack needed her strength to survive whatever darkness was coming." The words hit her like physical blows, each one rewriting everything she thought she knew about herself, about her place in this world, about the cosmic joke that had placed her in a servant's uniform in the very palace where she was apparently destined to be something far greater. "That's impossible," she whispered. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't, could feel the truth of it resonating in her bones, in the way her wolf had always felt too large for her skin, too powerful for someone who was supposed to be nothing. No one, forgettable. "I'm from the Eastern Pack. My parents were teachers. We had no royal blood, no special lineage. We were just ordinary wolves who died with everyone else when the rogues came." Alaric moved toward her, not with the predatory grace of last night, but with something more careful, more hesitant, as though approaching something sacred that might shatter if handled wrong. And when he was close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his eyes, the exhaustion carved into the lines of his face, he said, "Bloodlines hide, Sarah, especially when there are those who would destroy them to prevent prophecy from being fulfilled. And the Eastern Pack has always been known as a sanctuary for those who needed to disappear, to live quiet lives away from the politics and power struggles of the greater territories. So perhaps your parents knew exactly who you were. Perhaps they died protecting the secret of what you would become. Perhaps the massacre wasn't random violence, but a targeted attack to prevent you from ever reaching maturity, from ever discovering your true nature." She wanted to reject it, wanted to cling to the simple narrative of random tragedy and unfortunate survival. But pieces were clicking into place with terrible clarity, memories she had dismissed as unimportant suddenly taking on new meaning. Her mother's fierce protectiveness, her father's insistence that she learn to shield her thoughts and hide her scent. The way they had moved territories 3 times before she was 10, always staying one step ahead of something she had been too young to understand. "When I heard your wolf's name," Alaric continued, his voice dropping to something almost vulnerable, "I didn't just collapse from shock, I collapsed because the bond activated. Because every cell in my body recognized you as mate, as Luna, as the other half of my soul that I've been unconsciously searching for my entire life. And the force of that recognition, the weight of 1,000 years of destiny slamming into me all at once. It overwhelmed my wolf, brought me to my knees in front of my entire court, exposed a vulnerability that I've spent 3 decades learning to hide." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't move, he brushed his fingers against her cheek, the touch sending electricity racing through her nerve endings, igniting something primal and powerful that made her wolf surge forward with a possessiveness that startled her. "I mocked you," he said, and there was genuine anguish in his voice now. "I humiliated you in front of everyone, treated you like you were less than nothing when you are, in fact, everything. The answer to every prayer the Pack elders have been offering to the moon for the past decade. The solution to a succession crisis that threatens to tear the Northern Territories apart. And I can't take back those words. Can't undo that cruelty, but I'm asking you now, not as a king to a servant, but as a wolf to his mate, for the chance to make this right." The doors burst open before she could respond, the council flooding into the room like a tidal wave of disapproval and demand, led by Elder Morgana, a woman whose face looked like it had been carved from ice, and whose eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had outlived 3 Alpha Kings and intended to outlive this one too. "This is absurd," Morgana snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. One fainting spell and you're ready to declare this nobody. This refugee from a pack so weak it couldn't even defend itself, as the prophesied Luna? Have you lost your mind along with your dignity, Alaric? The other elders murmured agreement, their voices creating a chorus of skepticism and outright hostility. And Sarah could see the political calculation in their eyes. The way they viewed her not as a person, but as a threat to their influence, to the carefully maintained power structure that kept them relevant. And she understood with sudden clarity that accepting this destiny would mean not just becoming Luna, but surviving those who would prefer she didn't. Alaric's expression hardened, the vulnerability vanishing behind the mask of command he wore so well. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. I am not asking for your permission. Morgana, I am informing you of what is, what has always been, what was written in blood and moonlight long before any of us drew breath. And if you cannot accept that, then you are welcome to challenge me for the throne, here and now, and we will settle this matter the way our ancestors did, with tooth and claw and the kind of violence that leaves only one wolf standing. The room fell silent. The elders exchanging glances, weighing the threat, calculating odds. And Sarah realized she was watching the careful dance of pack politics, where power was constantly tested and constantly reasserted, where even a king had to prove his right to rule not just once, but over and over again. It was Marcus who broke the stalemate, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who had earned his position through blood and loyalty rather than birthright. If she is truly Iron Widow reborn, he said, his voice measured and reasonable, then there should be a way to prove it. Shouldn't there? The old texts speak of signs, of abilities that the first Luna possessed, ways to verify the authenticity of the claim before we stake the entire pack's future on a name spoken in a moment of defiance. Morgana seized on this, her eyes lighting with predatory interest. Yes, let her prove it. Let her demonstrate the power that supposedly makes her worthy of standing beside our king. And if she fails, then we can dispense with this foolishness and focus on finding him a proper mate from one of the established bloodlines, someone whose lineage can be verified, whose loyalty is assured. Alaric looked torn, glancing between Sarah and the council, clearly reluctant to subject her to whatever test they had in mind, but equally aware that refusing would make him appear weak, would give the elders ammunition to use against him in the ongoing battle for control. And Sarah made the decision for him, stepping forward with a courage she didn't entirely feel. What would you have me do? The test was set for the following night, under the full moon in the sacred grove, where pack law dictated that all major decisions had to be witnessed by the ancient spirits that guarded their territory, and the intervening hours were a blur of preparation and whispered speculation, servants gossiping about the unprecedented situation, warriors taking bets on whether she would survive, elder wolves pulling dusty volumes from the library and debating the finer points of prophecy interpretation. Ilara the healer came to her room as the sun was setting, carrying a wooden box carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering candlelight. And she sat on the edge of the bed with the weariness of someone who had seen too much, lived too long, carried too many secrets. "They're going to ask you to call the moon," Ilara said without preamble, her voice cracking with age and something that might have been sympathy, "to prove that you carry the blessing, the direct connection to the lunar power that made Iron Widow more than just strong but practically invincible. And I need you to understand that most wolves who attempt this die, their bodies unable to contain that much raw energy, their minds shattered by the direct touch of divine force. So if you have any doubt, any hesitation, you need to walk away now because pride isn't worth your life." But Sarah knew she couldn't walk away, knew that even if she tried they would find her, would hunt her down as either a threat or a fraud, and that her only real choice was to go forward, to either prove herself or die trying, to embrace the destiny that apparently had been written into her DNA before she was born. "How do I do it?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. And Ilara opened the box to reveal a silver dagger, its blade inscribed with runes that glowed faintly blue. "You offer blood and intention. You open yourself completely to the moon's power. and you trust that if you truly are who we think you are, she will answer, will flow through you without destroying you, will mark you in a way that cannot be denied or disputed. The grove was ancient, trees so old they predated written language, their branches twisted into shapes that seemed almost deliberate, almost purposeful. And as Sarah walked barefoot across the moss-covered ground, she could feel the weight of history pressing down on her. Centuries of rituals and ceremonies and blood oaths soaking into the earth beneath her feet. The entire pack had gathered, hundreds of wolves forming a circle around the central clearing, their eyes reflecting moonlight like a constellation of earth-bound stars. And at the far end stood Alaric, flanked by his council, his expression unreadable but his body language tense. Coiled, ready to intervene if things went wrong, Morgana stepped forward, holding the silver dagger, and her voice rang out clear and cold. "Sarah of the Eastern Pack, you stand accused of claiming a heritage you have not earned, of speaking a name that belongs to legend and prophecy. And we are here to determine whether you are blessed or merely delusional, whether you are Luna or liar, whether you deserve to stand beside our king or should be cast out for your presumption." The words were meant to intimidate, to break her confidence, but Sarah felt strangely calm, her wolf surging forward with a certainty that bordered on arrogance, and she took the dagger from Morgana's hand without hesitation, feeling the blade pulse against her palm like a living heartbeat. She walked to the center of the clearing, to the flat stone that served as an altar, its surface stained dark with the blood of generations, and she pressed the blade to her palm, drawing it across her skin in one smooth motion, watching as crimson welled up and dripped onto the ancient stone. The pain was sharp and immediate, grounding her in the present moment, and she raised her bloody hand to the sky, to the full moon that hung overhead like a silver eye, and she whispered words she didn't remember learning, words in the old tongue that bubbled up from some deep place inside her. "Grandmother Moon, Mother of all wolves, I offer myself as vessel, as bridge between earth and sky, between mortal and divine. If I am yours, then claim me, mark me. Let all who witness know that your blessing runs in my veins and your fire burns in my soul." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. And she felt doubt creep in, felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her back, felt the possibility of her own execution if this failed. But then the moon seemed to pulse, seemed to grow brighter, and power slammed into her like a lightning strike, white-hot and overwhelming, filling every cell, every atom, setting her nerves on fire and her wolf howling in triumph as energy poured through her in a torrent that should have killed her, but instead felt like coming home, like remembering something fundamental about herself that she had forgotten. Her eyes snapped open, and she knew without seeing that they were glowing silver, pure lunar light replacing her natural color. And when she looked down at her hands, she saw the blood had stopped flowing, the wound sealing itself, and intricate silver marks were spreading up her arms like living tattoos, ancient pack symbols that marked her as something more than ordinary, something consecrated, something claimed by the divine. The pack fell to their knees as one, even the elders dropping in deference to power they couldn't deny, couldn't argue with, and only Alaric remained standing, his face transformed by an expression of such fierce pride and possessive hunger that it made her breath catch. And then he was moving toward her, crossing the clearing in long strides. And when he reached her, he dropped to one knee, not in submission, but in offering. His head bowed, his throat bared in the ultimate gesture of trust and vulnerability. "My Luna," he said, his voice rough with emotion, with awe, with the kind of devotion that legends were built on. "My mate, my Iron Widow, I am yours as you are mine, bound by blood and moon and destiny. And I swear before all witnesses that I will spend the rest of my life proving worthy of you, protecting you, cherishing you, and making amends for every moment I failed to see what you were." She reached down with her marked hand, touching his face, feeling the mate bond snap into place with such force it nearly brought her to her knees beside him, a connection so profound and unbreakable that she knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, whatever challenges they faced, they would face them together, two halves of a whole that had been separated for far too long, finally reunited under the watchful eye of the moon that had orchestrated their meeting from the beginning. The celebration that followed lasted 3 days. The pack rejoicing not just in the discovery of their prophesied Luna, but in the validation of ancient beliefs, the confirmation that their traditions and stories and faith in the divine order were not mere superstition, but truth. And wolves came from all 5 territories to witness the marking, to pledge loyalty to the Luna who had been hidden among them as a servant, to offer gifts and tribute and support for the new era that was beginning. But not everyone celebrated, and Sarah quickly learned that power came with enemies, that there were those who viewed her elevation as a threat to their own ambitions, and chief among them was Lady Vivian, a visiting Alpha's daughter who had been in negotiations with the council about a potential political marriage to Alaric, who had spent the past year positioning herself as the obvious choice for Luna, and who now found herself completely displaced by a girl who had been serving wine just days before. Vivian was beautiful in the way of predators, all sharp edges and calculated charm, and she moved through the celebration like a shark circling wounded prey, spreading subtle poison, planting seeds of doubt, reminding anyone who would listen that prophecies could be misinterpreted, that tests could be faked, that perhaps they were all being manipulated by forces they didn't understand, and Sarah could feel the undercurrent of resentment building despite the outward displays of loyalty and acceptance. The confrontation came on the 4th night, when Sarah was alone in the Luna's chambers that had been hastily prepared for her, rooms that had stood empty for 3 generations waiting for someone to claim them. And Vivian let herself in without knocking, her expression no longer carefully neutral but openly hostile, twisted with the kind of rage that comes from having your entire future ripped away without warning. "You think you've won," Vivian hissed, closing the door behind her with deliberate care, ensuring they wouldn't be overheard. "You think that because the moon put on a little light show, and the pack is desperate for any sign of divine favor that you're safe, that you're secure, but you're nothing, Sarah. You're a girl with no training, no allies, no understanding of how to survive in this world. And I promise you that within a year you'll either be dead or broken, discarded like every other naive fool who thought destiny was enough to protect them." The words were meant to terrify, to plant doubt, to make Sarah question whether she belonged in this new role, but instead they ignited something fierce inside her. That same defiance that had made her speak the name Iron Widow in the first place. That refusal to be small, to be quiet, to accept that she deserved less simply because others said so. "I survived the massacre that killed my entire pack," Sarah said, her voice low and dangerous, her wolf rising to the surface, making her eyes flash silver in the candlelight. "I survived 6 months of abuse and invisibility and being treated like I was less than human. I survived a test that was designed to kill me. And I will sure as hell survive you, Vivian. Because unlike you, I don't need schemes or manipulation or political maneuvering to prove my worth. I have the moon herself on my side. And if you come at me again, I will not show mercy just because you're angry your backup plan fell through." Vivian paled, clearly not expecting resistance, expecting the frightened servant girl she remembered rather than the Luna who stood before her now, marked and blessed and absolutely done with being underestimated. And she backed toward the door with all her earlier confidence evaporating, replaced by the primal recognition of a lesser predator facing a greater one. But before she could leave, before she could retreat to plot and scheme another day, the door opened and Alaric entered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as he took in the scene. His Luna facing down a wolf who had just threatened her, and his expression went absolutely feral. Protective rage transforming him into something truly frightening. "Did I just hear you threaten my mate?" he asked, his voice soft and deadly, the kind of tone that preceded violence. And Vivian stammered something about a misunderstanding, about just wanting to offer advice, but Alaric cut her off with a gesture. "You have until dawn to be off Northern Pack territory, and you can tell your father that any alliance he was hoping to build through marriage is now void. That if he wants trade agreements or territory access, he'll have to earn them through loyalty to the Luna you just insulted. And if I ever hear of you spreading rumors or attempting to undermine her again, I will personally ensure that your pack understands the consequences of harboring traitors." Vivian fled, and when the door closed behind her, Alaric turned to Sarah, the rage melting into concern, into fear that she had been harmed, into desperate need to reassure himself that she was safe. and she went to him, letting him wrap her in his arms, feeling the tremor that ran through his massive frame as he held her like something precious and fragile, despite knowing she was neither. The months that followed were a whirlwind of transformation as Sarah learned what it meant to be Luna, not just in title, but in practice, studying pack law and territory management and the complex web of alliances that kept the 5 territories from descending into war. And she discovered that she was good at it, that the same skills that had helped her survive as an invisible servant, the ability to read people and anticipate needs and navigate dangerous situations, translated remarkably well to leadership when paired with actual power and authority. She reformed the servant system, ensuring that no one else would endure what she had, created councils that included voices from all levels of the pack hierarchy rather than just the elite bloodlines. And slowly, methodically, she began to dismantle the structures that had allowed cruelty to flourish unchecked. And while this won her fierce loyalty from the common wolves, it also deepened the resentment among the old guard who saw their influence eroding with each progressive change. Threats came, both direct and subtle, assassination attempts that were thwarted by loyal guards and Marcus's paranoid security measures, and poisoning that was caught by Alara's vigilance. And every attack only seemed to strengthen Sarah's resolve, to prove that she wasn't just some figurehead propped up by prophecy, but a true Luna who would fight for her pack with everything she had. And through it all, Alaric was beside her, no longer the arrogant king who had mocked a servant, but a partner who valued her input, who defended her decisions even when they challenged his own assumptions, who loved her with a fierce devotion that made the mate bond sing between them. And their connection grew deeper with each passing day, each shared challenge, each moment of vulnerability and trust. The true test came when word reached them of a gathering darkness in the borderlands. Rogue packs that had been dismissed as disorganized threats suddenly moving with coordinated purpose, attacking outlying territories with a brutality that reminded Sarah too much of the massacre that had taken her family. An intelligence report suggested they were being led by someone who understood pack structure intimately, someone who was targeting the weakest points in their defenses with surgical precision. The council wanted to respond with overwhelming force, to send the full weight of the Northern Pack army to crush the rebellion before it could spread. But Sarah argued for a different approach, her instincts telling her that this wasn't random violence but a deliberate provocation, an attempt to draw their forces away from the capital and leave them vulnerable to a larger attack. And Alaric trusted her judgment enough to hold back the military response in favor of enhanced intelligence gathering and defensive fortifications. It was during this tense period of waiting and watching that Alara came to them with a discovery that changed everything. An ancient text she had unearthed from the deepest archives, pages so old they crumbled at the edges, written in a dialect of the old tongue that took her weeks to translate. And what she found there was both revelation and warning. The Iron Widow, according to this account, had not just been a powerful Luna, but a bridge between worlds, someone who could commune directly with the ancient spirits that governed wolf magic, who could call on powers that predated the packs themselves. But this gift had come with a price, a curse that followed the bloodline, because the forces that had killed the first Luna had not been rogues or rival packs, but something darker. An entity that fed on pack bonds and territorial magic, that sought to corrupt and consume the very thing that made wolves stronger together than apart. And it had sworn to return when the Iron Widow was reborn, to finish what it had started, to ensure that the bloodline ended permanently this time. Sarah felt ice flood her veins as Alara read the passages aloud. Descriptions of shadow wolves that moved like smoke and struck with claws that corrupted rather than killed, turning loyal pack members into mindless servants of chaos. And she understood with terrible clarity that the rogue attacks weren't just political unrest, but the opening moves of an ancient enemy that had waited centuries for her to emerge, that had probably orchestrated the massacre of her birth pack not as random violence, but as an attempt to kill her before she could mature, to prevent this exact moment where she stood as Luna with the power to oppose it. "There's more," Alara said, her voice heavy with dread. "The text says that the entity can only be defeated by the combined power of the Alpha King and his true Luna, that they must perform a ritual of binding that will anchor pack magic so deeply that corruption cannot take root. But the ritual requires a sacrifice, something precious given willingly. And it doesn't specify what that means. Only that without it, the darkness will spread until all 5 territories fall and wolves themselves cease to exist as anything but monsters. The weight of prophecy settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical burden. The understanding that her entire existence, every moment of suffering and survival, had been leading to this confrontation. This choice between sacrificing something precious or watching everything burn. And when she looked at Alaric, she saw the same realization in his eyes. The same grim determination mixed with bone-deep fear, not for himself, but for what might be asked of them. What price the universe might demand for salvation. They prepared for the ritual in the sacred grove, the same place where Sarah had been tested and marked. And the entire pack gathered once more. But this time there was no celebration, only solemn recognition of what was at stake. And warriors stood in concentric circles, providing protection, while Alara and the remaining moon priestesses drew intricate patterns on the ground, using silver dust and crushed moonstone, symbols of binding and protection and ancient power that hummed with barely contained energy. Sarah wore robes of pure white, marked with the silver symbols that had appeared on her skin during her first calling. And Alaric stood beside her in the ceremonial armor of the first Alpha King. Pieces that had been locked in the vaults for generations, waiting for someone worthy to wear them. And together, they looked less like rulers of a modern pack and more like warriors from legend, avatars of an age when wolves walked closer to the divine and paid for that proximity in blood and sacrifice. The ritual began at moonrise, Alara's voice rising and falling in the old tongue, calling on the ancient spirits to witness and bless their working, and Sarah and Alaric knelt facing each other, their hands clasped, their eyes locked. And they spoke the words of binding that would merge not just their souls but their power, would make them a single entity in the eyes of pack magic, would create a bond so unbreakable that not even death could sever it. And as they spoke, Sarah felt her power flowing out, intertwining with Alaric's, creating something greater than either of them alone, a blazing column of silver light that shot up from the grove and painted the sky, visible for miles in every direction, a beacon and a challenge and a declaration that the Luna had risen and would not fall quietly. The darkness answered, rolling in from the borderlands like a toxic fog, shadow wolves emerging from the mist with eyes that burned red and mouths that dripped corruption, and the pack warriors engaged them with desperate courage, fighting to buy time for the ritual to complete. But for every shadow beast they destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. And Sarah could hear the screams of wolves being corrupted, their minds twisted, their loyalty perverted into something monstrous. And she wanted to break the ritual to help them, but Ilara's sharp command kept her focused, kept her pouring power into the binding, even as her heart broke for those who were suffering. At the center of the shadow army came the entity itself, a massive wolf-shaped void that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And when it spoke, its voice was like ice grinding against stone, ancient and malevolent and utterly certain of its victory. "Iron Widow," it hissed, the words carrying across the battlefield, cutting through the sounds of combat. "You think you can defeat me with love and loyalty and pretty rituals, but I was old when your bloodline was young. I have consumed packs and territories and entire bloodlines, and I will add yours to the collection. Will watch as everything you tried to build crumbles to ash and shadow." Alaric snarled, his wolf surging forward, wanting to tear apart the thing that threatened his mate. But Sarah held him steady, held them both in the eye of the storm, because she understood now what the sacrifice was, what precious thing they had to give willingly. And it wasn't their lives or their power or anything they possessed. It was their certainty, their control, their ability to protect themselves. They had to open completely, become vulnerable in a way that went against every survival instinct, had to trust that the pack would hold while they became the anchor. And that trust, that willingness to be defenseless while others defended them, that was the sacrifice the ritual demanded. She met Alaric's eyes and saw the moment he understood too, saw the fear flash across his face because vulnerability was death for an Alpha King, was the one thing he had been trained never to show. But he nodded, his trust in her absolute, and together they opened their defenses. dropped every shield and wall and protection they had built over lifetimes of learning to be strong, and they poured everything they were into the pack bonds, into the connections that linked every wolf in the territory, strengthening those threads until they glowed like silver fire. And the entity screamed as it realized what they were doing, lunged forward to stop them. But Marcus and his warriors threw themselves in its path, giving ground slowly, buying seconds with blood and courage. And those seconds were enough. The binding snapped into place with a sound like thunder, like the world itself being reforged. And silver light exploded outward in a wave that washed over every wolf in the territory, burning away corruption, healing wounds, restoring minds that had been twisted. And when it hit the entity, the ancient darkness shrieked in agony, its form unraveling, dissolving like smoke in sunlight. Because it couldn't exist in a place where pack bonds were that strong, where loyalty ran that deep, where every wolf was connected not just to their alpha and Luna, but to each other in a web of mutual protection and care that left no room for corruption to take root. The shadow wolves collapsed, returning to ordinary rogues who looked confused and horrified by what they had been forced to do. And the toxic fog lifted, revealing a dawn sky painted in shades of gold and rose. And Sarah and Alaric knelt in the center of the grove, still clasped together, exhausted beyond measure, but alive, victorious, and forever changed by what they had done. The aftermath was complex and painful. Wolves who had been corrupted struggling with guilt and trauma, families mourning those who had fallen in defense of the ritual, and the massive task of rebuilding trust and structure after such a fundamental threat. But through it all, Sarah worked tirelessly, her experience with suffering giving her unique insight into how to help others heal, how to create space for grief while also moving forward. And slowly, gradually, the pack found its footing again, stronger for having survived, more unified for having fought together, and the changes she had been implementing gained new momentum because everyone had seen what happened when wolves stood together versus when they were divided. The other 4 territories sent delegations to witness what the Northern Pack had become, to understand how they had defeated a threat that had seemed impossible, and gradually alliances formed, not through political marriage or territorial negotiation, but through genuine respect and shared purpose. And Sarah found herself not just Luna of the North, but a figure that other territories looked to for guidance, for inspiration, for proof that the old ways and the new could be balanced, that tradition and progress weren't enemies but partners in building something better. Alaric watched her lead with a pride that bordered on worship, and their bond deepened into something beyond mate or love or destiny, becoming a partnership so fundamental that neither could imagine existing without the other. And when she told him 6 months after the ritual that she was carrying his child, that the bloodline would continue, he wept with joy and relief and a gratitude so profound it made her heart ache. And she understood that this was the true victory, not defeating the darkness but creating life and hope and future in its wake. The council, even Morgana, came to accept her not just as prophesied Luna, but as earned leader, her decisions proving wise more often than not, her instincts for pack welfare uncanny. And the few who still harbored resentment found themselves increasingly isolated as the majority rallied behind the Luna who had literally given everything to protect them, who had made herself vulnerable so they could be safe, who embodied the very best of what it meant to lead not from power but from service. Ilara, in one of her last acts before passing peacefully in her sleep at an age no one could accurately calculate, told Sarah that she had exceeded the original Iron Widow's legacy, that where the first Luna had been powerful and feared, the second was powerful and loved, and that made all the difference, made her something new rather than just a reborn shadow, and that perhaps that was the real prophecy all along. Not that she would be identical to her predecessor, but that she would learn from that history and become something better, something evolved, a Luna for a new age. Sarah stood in the grove one evening as the sun set and the moon rose, her hand resting on the growing curve of her belly, Alaric beside her with his arm around her shoulders, and she thought about the servant girl who had spoken a name in defiance, never imagining it would lead. Here, to power and purpose and a love so consuming it felt like being remade from the inside out, and she sent a silent prayer of thanks to the moon, to her parents who had protected her at the cost of their own lives, to the universe that had guided her through hell to deliver her home, and she promised that she would be worthy of it, would honor the sacrifices made by becoming the kind of leader the pack deserved, the kind of Luna that legends would remember not for her power, but for her heart. And as the moonlight bathed them both in silver, she felt the baby kick for the first time, felt the future moving inside her, and she knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. Alpha King. And Iron Widow, bound by love and destiny and the unbreakable will to protect what they had built from the ashes of pain and loss, and a joke that became a revelation, that became a love story, that became a legend. If you loved Sarah and Alaric's journey from mockery to destiny, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another Alpha Reversed story. Check out the playlist for more tales of rejected mates, hidden Lunas, and the kind of redemption that only true love can bring, and drop a comment telling me what you'd do if you discovered you were destined for greatness in disguise. Until next time, remember that sometimes what looks like an ending is just the universe clearing space for your true beginning.